In the winter of 1965, three men walked into a closed tea house in Kowloon at 1:47 in the morning. They had come to settle what they called a matter of disrespect. By the time the police arrived 7 minutes later, two of them couldn't stand. The third refused to speak. Bruce Lee never mentioned the incident publicly. But the tea house owner did. So did the night janitor. And so did Officer Chen, who filed a report he was later told to destroy. This is what they remembered. Temple Street closed early in winter. By midnight, most shopkeepers had pulled their shutters and gone home. But on Tuesday nights, the tea house stayed open, not for customers, for practice. Mr. Lau, the owner, had made an arrangement with Bruce Lee 6 months earlier. After closing twice a week, Lee could use the space. 20 Hong Kong dollars extra. Clean floors before leaving. No noise complaints. Lau didn't ask what style Lee was teaching. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough to know this wasn't the kind of kung fu performed at festivals. Lee didn't lecture. He showed a movement, a principle. Then he'd have the students try it slowly, without power, until the structure was right. Speed hides mistakes, he'd told them. Slowness reveals truth. That night he was working on interception, not blocking intercepting. The difference, he explained, was intention. A block stops force. An interception redirects it before it arrives. You don't meet the attack, he said. You're already there when it begins. It was 1:40 when Mr. Lau noticed the three men across the street. They weren't moving, just standing under the awning of a closed nudie shop, looking in through the tea house window. Lau had run a business in Kowloon for 23 years. He knew when someone was waiting for closing time. He considered saying something to Lee, but Lee was in the middle of explaining structure, how the body becomes a single unit, when the joints are aligned, how power isn't generated, it's borrowed from the ground. Lau didn't interrupt. He went back to wiping down the counter, but he kept the phone within reach. At 1:47, the door opened. No knock, no announcement, just the sound of the brass handle turning and three men stepping inside. The cold air came with them. So did the silence. The students stopped mid-movement. Lee didn't turn immediately. He finished watching one pair complete their drill. Then, slowly, he looked toward the door. The man in front was older. 40, maybe 45. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, old training marks, the kind you got from years of striking sand and gravel. He wore a plain worker's jacket, dark trousers. Nothing flashy, but the way he stood weight slightly forward. Shoulders told you he hadn't come to ask questions. Lee remained still. His students instinctively stepped back toward the walls. Mr. Pasanab, Lau set down his rag. No one spoke for 5 seconds. In Cantonese tradition, silence before a challenge is a form of respect. It says, I acknowledge what you are, but it also says, I'm not afraid of it. The lead man took 2 steps forward. He stopped at the edge of the cleared space. His name was Chow Tai-Seng. In certain circles, they called him Iron Palm, not because of any legendary technique, but because he'd once broken a man's collarbone with an open-hand strike during a rooftop match in 1959. He ran a small school in Sham Shui Po, taught old-style Hung Gar, hard conditioning, traditional forms. He believed in lineage, in hierarchy, in proving your worth before you spoke about philosophy. 3 weeks earlier, at a private gathering in Mongkok, one of Chow's senior students had approached Bruce Lee. The student had heard about Lee's ideas about discarding classical forms, about adapting instead of repeating. He wanted to test them, publicly. In front of other masters, Lee had looked at him for a moment, then said one sentence. Fighting to prove a point is pointless. Then he'd walked away. The student took it as cowardice. Chow took it as disrespect, not to him personally, but to the old ways. to the teachers who had spent lifetimes refining techniques Li claimed were obsolete. And in Kowloon, in 1965, disrespect to tradition wasn't ignored, it was corrected. Now standing in Mr. Lau's tea house, Chow spoke for the first time. His voice was calm. Level. No theatrics. "We've come to settle a misunderstanding," he said. "You refused to show your skill. Tonight, you will." Bruce Lee didn't move. Didn't respond immediately. One of his students later recalled that Lee's breathing didn't change. His posture didn't shift. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, and waited for Chow to finish. Then Lee spoke. 4 words. Quiet. Clear. "This is not necessary." Chow's expression didn't change. But the 2 men behind him shifted their weight. They'd expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even an apology. What they didn't expect was calm. It made them uncertain. And uncertainty in a confrontation is a crack in the foundation. Lee was still sitting on the edge of one of the wooden tables. He hadn't stood up yet. That detail mattered. In martial arts cultures, standing means engagement. Sitting means you're not taking the challenge seriously, or you're so confident it doesn't require effort. Either way, it's a statement. Chow took another step forward. Now he was only 6 feet away, close enough that his intent couldn't be misread, close enough that walking away would look like retreat. Lee looked up at him, not defiant, not afraid. Just observing, as if he were watching a student make a predictable mistake and waiting to see if they'd correct it themselves. "If I show you," Lee said, "will you leave?" The question hung in the air. It wasn't a taunt. It wasn't sarcasm. It was a genuine offer. A boundary. One last chance to turn what was about to happen into something else. Chow smiled. Not in amusement. In certainty. "After you show us," he said, "we'll decide." That's when Lee stood up. Slowly. No sudden movements. No theatrics. He simply rose from the table, adjusted his stance, and took one step toward the center of the room. His hands remained at his sides. His weight was centered, balanced. One of the students, a young man named Tong later, said that Lee's face hadn't changed. No anger. No tension. Just focus. It was like watching someone prepare to write, Tong said years later. Not like watching someone prepare to fight. Chow's 2 companions began moving. Not aggressively, just positioning. One drifted toward the left side of the room. The other moved right, toward the door. Creating angles. Cutting off exits. It was coordinated. Practiced. They'd done this before. "Mr. Tools," Lau's hand finally reached for the phone. But before he could lift the receiver, Lee spoke again. Still calm. Still measured. "You should call," Lee said, not taking his eyes off Chow. "They'll need to come anyway." Lau hesitated. Then he dialed. The rotary phone clicked slowly. 999. Emergency dispatch. He spoke quietly into the receiver. Gave the address. Said there was a disturbance. Then he hung up and stepped back behind the counter. Chow hadn't moved, but his smile had faded. "Calling the police won't help you," he said. Lee didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked a different question. "Have you ever fought someone who didn't want to fight you?" Chow frowned. It wasn't the question he expected. "What does that matter?" "It matters," Lee said, "because you're about to." What happened next was remembered differently by everyone in that room, but certain details never changed across any of the accounts. Chow moved first. Not a wild charge, but a measured advance, a straight-line step with his lead hand rising into a traditional guard. His intention was to close distance, establish control, and force Lee into a corner where technique would matter less than weight and experience. He never made it past the second step. Lee's right hand intercepted Chow's wrist, not by blocking it, by meeting it at the exact moment it extended. Before the force could build. Before momentum could settle. The contact was brief. A redirection, and suddenly Chow's balance was wrong. He tried to reset. Pulled his arm back. Shifted his weight, but Lee's left hand was already at Chow's elbow, and his right foot had stepped to an angle Chow couldn't compensate for. In wrestling, they call it breaking structure. In judo, it's kuzushi. Lee didn't call it anything, he just did it. Chow went down. Not hard. Not violently. Just down. Not violently. Just down. One moment he was standing. The next he was on one knee, his arm hyperextended just enough to keep him there without injury. 2 seconds had passed. The man on the left moved immediately. His name was Leong. He was younger than Cho. Faster. He came in low, aiming for Lee's midsection of grappler's entry, the kind of attack meant to negate striking range and bring the fight to the ground. Lee's knee came up, not into Leong's face, into his shoulder. A check. A stop. Leong's momentum carried him forward anyway, but now he was offline. His hands grasped at air. Lee sidestepped, and as Leong passed, Lee's palm pressed against the back of his head. Not a strike, just guidance. Leong hit the floor face first. Not injured, just stopped. 4 seconds total. The third man, the one by the door, didn't move. He'd been watching. He'd seen enough. When Lee looked at him, he raised both hands slightly, palms forward, a universal gesture. Not me, it said. I'm done. Chow was back on his feet. His face was red. Not from exertion, from something else. Humiliation, maybe, or realization. He didn't attack again, but he didn't leave either. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at Lee. You didn't have to embarrass me, Chow said. Lee's expression didn't change. I didn't, he said. You came here to test something. Now you know. That's not embarrassment. That's learning. Chow's jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might try again, but then the sound of a siren cut through the silence, distant but getting closer. The police were 3 minutes out. Leong was sitting up now, rubbing his jaw. Not injured. Just dazed. The third man had already moved toward the door. Chow looked at Lee one last time. This isn't finished, Chow said. Lee shook his head. Yes, it is. Officer Chen arrived at 154, 7 minutes after Mr. Lau's call. He was a 15-year veteran of the Kowloon precinct. He'd responded to plenty of after-hours disturbances, gambling disputes, drunk arguments, gang posturing. He knew what violence looked like. When he walked into the tea house, what he saw didn't match the call. No broken furniture. No blood. No one yelling. Just 3 men standing near the door, and Bruce Lee sitting back at the table where he'd started, demonstrating a wrist lock to one of his students. Chow and his 2 companions were outside by the time Chen's partner arrived. They were calm, cooperative. When Chen asked what happened, Chow said only, "A disagreement about respect." Chen looked at Mr. Lau. Lau shrugged. "A disagreement about tea quality," he said. His face was completely serious. Chen didn't believe either of them. But he also didn't see evidence of a crime. No one was hurt. No property was damaged. No one wanted to press charges. He could have pushed. He could have separated them, taken statements, made it official. But he'd been a cop long enough to know when a situation had already resolved itself. He walked over to Lee. "You're the martial arts teacher," he said. It wasn't a question. Lee nodded. "I teach movement," he said. "Did you move tonight?" Chen asked. Lee looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Only when necessary." Chen wrote that in his report. Restraint techniques applied. No visible injuries requiring hospitalization. He underlined the word restraint twice, then he closed his notebook. Before leaving, Chen looked out the window. Chow was still standing by the patrol car. He was staring back at the tea house, not with anger. With something else, calculation maybe, or respect. Chen couldn't tell. Inside, Li had returned to teaching. His students were quiet, focused. They worked slowly through the technique he'd shown them, how to redirect force before it arrived, how to meet intention with structure. No one mentioned what had just happened. No one needed to. Mr. Lau locked the door after the police left. He poured Li a cup of tea. Didn't say anything. Just set it down on the table and went back to cleaning. Li took one sip. Then he went back to teaching. The night continued as if nothing had interrupted it. Chow Tai-Seng never spoke publicly about that night. But his students noticed changes. He stopped issuing challenges, stopped talking about proving lineage. When asked why, he'd say only, "There are different ways to teach." One of his students later said that Chow had gone to the tea house expecting to expose a fraud, someone who talked philosophy but couldn't fight. What he found instead was someone who could fight but chose not to. That, the student said, was harder to argue with. Within weeks, the story had spread through Hong Kong's martial arts underground. Not as gossip. As a lesson. Details varied depending on who told it. But the core remained the same. 3 men had challenged Bruce Lee. The challenge lasted less than 10 seconds. No one was seriously hurt. And afterward, Lee went back to teaching. Some told it as a warning, don't underestimate the quiet ones. Others told it as philosophy, real skill doesn't need to prove itself. But those who'd been there told it differently. They said it wasn't about skill. It was about intent. He didn't want to hurt them, one student explained years later. He needed them to understand. There's a difference. Officer Chen kept a copy of his report in his desk drawer for 30 years. The original was filed, then quietly removed from records 3 days later. No explanation was given. But Chen had made it carbon copy. He kept it not as evidence, but as a reminder. In 1996, a year before his death, a journalist asked him about it. The journalist had been researching Bruce Lee's time in Hong Kong and had heard rumors of an incident in 1965. Chen confirmed it happened. When asked for details, he said only this: "I'd been to hundreds of fights. Bar fights, street fights, gang fights. Men trying to hurt each other. What I saw that night wasn't a fight. It was a teaching. The difference is, in a fight, someone wins. In a teaching, everyone learns, even if they don't want to." The tea house on Temple Street closed in 1983. Mr. Trender sighed. Lau retired and moved to Canada. Before he left, he gave one interview to a local paper. The reporter asked if he remembered anything unusual from his years running the business. Lau thought for a moment, then he said, "I once saw 3 men walk in looking for a fight. They left looking for something else. I don't think they ever found it, but they stopped looking for fights." When Bruce Lee died in 1973, Chow Tai-Seng attended the funeral. He didn't speak to the family, didn't make a statement. He simply stood in the back, paid his respects, and left. One of Lee's former students saw him there and asked why he'd come. Chow's answer was short. "To thank a teacher," he said. The incident was never mentioned in any of Lee's biographies. His students rarely spoke about it, and when they did, they kept it vague. Not out of secrecy, but out of respect. Because the point of that night wasn't the confrontation. It was what came after. Bruce Lee had been given a chance to prove himself. He chose instead to prove a principle, that the highest form of martial skill isn't domination, it's control, not over an opponent, over yourself. And for the 3 men who walked into that tea house in 1965, the lesson lasted longer than 7 minutes. It lasted the rest of their lives.